So, we have to make this video. We do. We have to acknowledge greatness in Edmonton. And no, we are not talking about McDrysaddle. We know how good those guys can be on any given night. But I wanted to talk about one of the more underrated guys who just so happens to be scoring points at an incredible rate, despite being given peanuts for ice time. Because today we are talking about one of the most productive guys on the team. He is a former Vancouver Canucks prospect, and he's a really polarizing prospect. A guy that a lot of fans, myself included, didn't really want the Canucks to draft back in 2019, but a guy that they inevitably did end up drafting. Today we are talking about 10th overall pick, Vasili Podkolzin. And the interesting part about Podkolzin is, his name has surfaced in the Vancouver beat the past few weeks or so. Because with all this fallout with the Canucks management and ownership and the coaching staff and everybody talking about problems with Vancouver, this and that, Pettersson and Miller fought, Rick Tocchet doesn't want to come back, Quinn Hughes is going to leave, and everything in between, we had this post made on May 2nd by Taj. It transcribes some quotes from Rick Dhaliwal from that day's Donnie and Dolly. Judd Brackett, Canucks director of amateur scouting at the time, didn't want to draft Podkolzin. That was a betting pick. Brackett wanted to take Boldy. And now we are looking at Matt Boldy as one of the top players in Minnesota, as a total monster, point-producing machine, a 70-point guy, signed on to a reasonable dollar amount. That guy in Vancouver would have been nuts. But we don't live in that timeline now, don't we? So let's go back over to Podkolzin and look at how the Canucks have gotten the absolute worst value out of this draft pick. Might I remind you that the reason Vancouver even drafted Podkolzin in the top 10 in 2019 is because in that previous season's Hlinka Gretzky Cup, he absolutely popped off, scoring 11 points in 5 games as the captain for Team Russia. Keep in mind, the Hlinka Gretzky Cup happens in August of the season, so even though it says 2018-19, this happened in August of 2018. He got drafted almost a full year later in 2019, despite not having much league play results that were substantial by any stretch of the imagination. Sure, he had 8 points in 12 games, but he was all over the place, playing with Team Russia, the U18 and the U20 and the VHL and the KHL, and playing in 2 playoff series as well. Podkolzin never got any consistent development in his draft season, his draft plus 1 season, or even his draft plus 2 season. Okay, his draft plus 2 was a little better. He was in the KHL the entire time, but he still only had 11 points in 35 games in the regular season. His explosion of offense, though, in the playoffs was noteworthy. 11 points in 16 games. At this time, he was a 19-year-old player. But Podkolzin in Vancouver was never fully able to take over those skills and dominate in the way that he was dominating once before. There were folks like Craig Button, after Podkolzin had that crazy tournament in August of 2018, that were saying that Podkolzin had similar qualities to Pavel Datsyuk, an absolute dog on the forecheck, a back-checking machine, defensively responsible with sniping ability and hands. That was the scouting report, and it's why Podkolzin was ranked as highly as number 3 at some point during the 2018-19 draft season. In fact, his final ranking by Elite Prospects was number 5. Future considerations had him at number 4. But he slipped to 10, and despite Canucks fans wanting Cole Caulfield and Matt Boldy, Pods ended up being the pick. And it's always funny to bring up, but you could see even my reaction when the pick was made. I really wanted Cole Caulfield, and I was stunned that Vancouver ended up taking the inconsistent, bouncing around all over the place Russian. You can say, oh, Lego, you're just salty that he didn't end up becoming good, and that's why you're making this negative video about him, etc., etc. You can make that argument, but I've been saying it all the way back since 2019 that it was a really surprising pick, man. And there were a ton of concerns as to whether or not his skills, the offensive production that had him ranked in the top 10 to begin with, would have translated. And it didn't, really, with Vancouver. He was up and down in the NHL and the AHL with Vancouver and Abbotsford, and he didn't really have the offensive creativity to stick around in the NHL, nor did he have the willingness to do it. You could tell that this was a guy playing 90% of the hockey he played in Vancouver with hesitation. He was holding himself back from trying crazy things offensively. He would just dump it in, make the safe pass, go for a big body hit, and it would work. Like, it's an effective play facilitating type of style, but it lacked so much depth that Podkolzin ended up getting traded to Edmonton last year. And Podkolzin went from a guy who had scored 9 points in 58 games in the prior 2 seasons with the Vancouver Canucks to scoring 24 points in 82 games in the regular season with the Oilers. And in the playoffs, guess what? The guy has 6 points in 8 games with Edmonton. He scored a goal and an assist yesterday as the Oilers beat Vegas in game number 2 of their second round series, and he had scored a bunch of assists in all of the other games against LA. And look at the ice time for some of these games. 9 minutes, 8 minutes, 7 minutes. He's producing points with less than 10 minutes a night per game. The Vancouver Canucks have gotten the worst value possible out of this 10th overall draft pick because not only is this guy not as good as the Boldies or the Caulfields or the other players that were drafted after him, but the Canucks are not even getting the best version of him like Edmonton is getting right now. Take a look at this post made by Sapster on Twitter. It talks about how Podkolzin has 6 points in 8 playoff games. In Game 7 last year against the Oilers, Vancouver scratched Podkolzin, who had a point in Game 5, by the way, in favor of players like Phil DiGiuseppe, Nils Åman, and Sam Lafferty. In fact, while we're on the PDG thing, I think it's hilarious that Phil DiGiuseppe, 5 goals, 5 assists in 51 games, averaged the same ice time, 12:06 per game, as Nils Höglander, who had 24 goals and 12 assists in 80 games played. Essentially, this is a criticism on the Canucks head coach and how the lines were deployed and which players were utilized more than others. A reply here says, I just couldn't believe that after Brock Besser was ruled out for Game 7 that we went for a less offensive upside player with less size. Pods has a higher ceiling than all those guys that got in. In a 1-game winner-takes-all, I want the upside. Playing safe, I think it should say, doesn't win. And then Sap says a real ballsy organization would have known they had nothing to lose and dressed like Karamaki to see if he could surprise the Oilers. That would have been crazy. And for what it's worth, another reply does say, I promise you, not playing Podkolzin wasn't the reason the Canucks lost. Also, counting stats like that is lazy and barely tells the whole story. Fair. I don't think dressing Podkolzin would have guaranteed a win, but at the same time, it does feel a little bit awkward when you remember those decisions and you think about just how good, quote-unquote, Sam Lafferty and Nils Åman had been for the Vancouver Canucks last year. This year, okay, Åman had been fine, especially towards the end, but last year he wasn't that. Phil DiGiuseppe also plays a very Rick Tocchet style of hockey, so seeing him get a lot of ice time compared to some of the guys who are more productive, like Höglander, yeah, checks out, man. That's Rick Tocchet to a T. Podkolzin, you would think that he is a Rick Tocchet kind of guy with the skills that he does have, but for some reason he just could not be consistent enough, which was so frustrating, because now in Edmonton, he is consistent. So with this in mind, I want you to let me know your thoughts in the comment section below about the Canucks getting the absolute worst value they could have out of this Podkolzin draft pick, considering the players that they left on the board, and considering the fact that they traded Podkolzin for a 4th-round pick. We didn't even talk about that, but they traded him for a 4th-round pick, and that was it. The Oilers got away with getting a point-per-game guy, a near-point-per-game guy, for a 4th-round draft pick. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below about the Podkolzin trade and the Podkolzin story, how this is working out very great for Edmonton, and how the Canucks are just kind of sitting here sulking about it. Okay, maybe the Canucks aren't, but the fans are. And by fans, I mean me. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. I hope you enjoyed this video. And bye.